Hi class, welcome to chapter 4 where you're going to be learning about coping processes. I've divided the chapter material into a few different videos that are organized by major themes, and you'll see these on the content page under this module. So let's get started. In this chapter, we'll be reflecting on defense mechanisms. So to get you thinking about defense mechanisms, which of these is our refusal to acknowledge or face up to unpleasant realities in one's life? Is it intellectualization, fantasy, undoing, overcompensation, denial? Well, we'll be looking at these as we move forward, and we'll look at the answer to this. If you chose the answer denial, you're correct. So let's look at another one. Which of these is the correct answer? A method of looking at difficulties in a detached or abstract way. Is this denial, intellectualization, compensation, sublimation, or rationalization? This is something probably many of us have done before. So the correct answer is intellectualization. We'll be looking at this. We'll be looking at some other defense mechanisms in this chapter. Defense mechanisms are just one of many coping mechanisms, and they're certainly not the healthiest approach to coping, especially if we're using them often. So let's look at a series of statements, and I want you to identify what you think about these statements. So in other words, are these myths or are they realities? So by definition, all coping strategies are equally effective across stressful situations. What do you think? Is this definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you chose definitely false, you're right. We're going to be looking at many different coping strategies, and it's important that each individual has a variety of strategies that they can rely on. Not all strategies are going to work for every situation. So we need to think about which strategies are most appropriate and for which particular situation. Here's another one. What do you think? Cathartic activities like playing violent video games to blow off steam are highly effective coping strategies. I've heard people say that they like to do this, that they feel like this is helpful. So what do you think the research says? Do you think this is definitely false, mostly true, or definitely true? If you chose definitely false, you're right. Now, you may be the individual that has experienced this being an effective coping strategy, but you're probably the exception and not the norm. The research suggests that violent video game playing is not a highly effective coping strategy, and we're going to be looking at the effects of violent television and violent video games on our feelings and our thoughts and our behaviors. What about this one? Oh, we already did do this. If you chose definitely true, you're correct. And actually, humor can have a very positive impact on our ability to handle stress, and it can have a significant effect on our body's response to stress. For example, I've heard of hospitals that have cancer treatment centers where they actually will have regular stand-up comedians who come in to do stand-up comedy for cancer patients. And they found that this can be effective and helpful in the overall healing process and in people's reporting of symptoms from chemotherapy. So it seems to have a positive effect on how people experience cancer treatment, and that's just one example. What about this one? Some students procrastinate in an effort to optimize their efficiency. I know I have never done this before. I'm just joking. I actually have done this quite a bit before, and I have found that it's not a very effective way to get the best output. Yes, I can work under pressure like probably many of you can, but I find that when I don't work under pressure and I'm much more thoughtful about planning out my work and what I need to do for classes that I might be taking, because I am a student also. I'm in a PhD program. I think I may have mentioned that before. I'm just about I've actually completed my coursework, and I'll be taking my comprehensive exams in the summer. And if I were to procrastinate studying for those, that would be a big problem. And actually, it really worries me a lot to even think about that idea. So I'm trying to regularly study every single night for those comprehensive exams. So I know that many of you have probably found that procrastination has been effective for you, and that might be the exception. But I bet if you were to compare your performance in times when you haven't procrastinated and you've actually laid out goals and worked diligently towards meeting those goals and done so regularly, that your performance was actually better. There are always going to be exceptions, but when we think about being able to work under or being able to produce the best work, working under pressure can actually have a negative effect because of the stress that it creates. It might feel like we're doing well, but it can create a lot of stress, which can have a negative effect on how we think. It has an overall negative effect on cognitive functioning. So yes, we do procrastinate. Some do. Probably we would say to this, you might say definitely true. I would probably change this to say many students, but we can't really, we'd say some students, at least some, procrastinate thinking that this will optimize efficiency, but actually it doesn't seem to work out very well in the end for most of us. So we'll be looking at time management and what the research has to say about this. And I think what you're going to be learning in this chapter isn't only going to be helpful for you, of course, but it's also very important when we think about going into any helping profession. So we're going to be looking at concepts and themes, strategies, theories that are going to be useful for you in likely in the profession that you have chosen to pursue. So what are you going to be learning? Well, what you're going to be learning in this very brief section is you're going to learn about the overall concept of coping. You're also going to be learning about some of the coping strategies that people use, and you're going to be able to understand by the end of this section why it's beneficial to use a variety of coping strategies and how these strategies differ in their adaptive value. So what is coping? Coping refers to the efforts that we engage in to master, reduce, or tolerate the demands that are created by stress. It's important for us to note that people cope with stress in many different ways, and it is most adaptive to use a variety of coping strategies. And it's also important to note that coping strategies vary in their adaptive value. We're going to start by looking at coping mechanisms or patterns that have limited value. So you're going to be learning about giving up. You're going to be learning about catharsis or the adaptive value of releasing aggression. And while we might think that it may be adaptive to some degree, it actually turns out that it's not typically the best approach. That when we do behave aggressively or when we just let out those negative emotions that we have, we may think we're going to feel better, but actually, of course, it can create more problems for us. So we need to develop other ways of dealing with those negative emotions and feelings that we have. We're also going to be looking at indulging ourselves and some of the things that we might do that might immediately make us feel better, but then these particular approaches can have some long-term negative consequences. For example, things like overeating or relying on our phones a lot, becoming or using the internet too much. For some people, it might be gambling, it might be the use of substances. And so indulgence can be a pretty significant issue if we rely on it too much or if we're using it often. And then we're also going to be looking at self-blame, and we'll be looking at defense mechanisms. Now, you've learned about defense mechanisms in the personality chapter, but we're going to be looking at these in terms of what is their adaptive value in terms of reducing or getting rid of those uncomfortable feelings that we have. Sometimes when we experience stressors, we may feel like giving up, and sometimes that's what we might do. And we can associate this with a concept that's called learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a phrase or term that was coined in 1967 by an American psychologist whose name is Martin Seligman. And Martin Seligman was conducting research on animal behavior that involved delivering electric shocks to dogs. I realize that when you think about this type of study, it sounds horribly unethical. And of course, today we would not be doing studies like this. However, we can still get a lot of insight by looking at those studies that were done many years ago that perhaps weren't following ethical guidelines, or when ethical guidelines like we have today were not in place. We can find the same to be true in well-known studies like the one by Stanley Milgram, where he studied obedience. And we'll be looking at that one later on this semester. But certainly we can still gain a lot of insight by looking at unethical studies, not only about the study itself and the study results, but of course the significant importance of upholding ethical standards. With that being said, though, I do want to share with you what Martin Seligman did and what he found. So again, what Martin Seligman was doing and his fellow researchers were that they were delivering electric shocks to dogs, and dogs who learned that they couldn't escape the shock stopped trying in subsequent experiments, even when it became possible to avoid the shock by jumping over a barrier. And this particular phenomenon that they observed, it exists in many animal species and it exists in people. So, for example, Seligman also subjected people to loud, unpleasant noises. And then there was a lever that would or would not stop the sounds. And the group whose lever wouldn't stop the sound in the first round stopped trying to silence the noise in the second round. So people were exhibiting learned helplessness. We see learned helplessness in the real world, and learned helplessness can contribute to depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So for example, when someone's experiencing depression, they may believe that nothing will end their suffering, so they may stop seeking help completely. Or sometimes this can happen in educational settings where children feel that they can't perform well and they may stop trying to improve. And so overall, what's happening with learned helplessness is people develop a passive response to trauma. They believe then that trauma cannot be controlled and that stress cannot be controlled. And all of these have underneath them some sort of stress, some sort of aversive conditions. Learned helplessness is common for people who've experienced repeated traumatic events. For example, in people who were, as children, who experienced neglect or abuse, or people who've experienced domestic violence. So you might wonder, how can we overcome learned helplessness? Well, we can learn to overcome this by starting at a young age. That's one approach. Of course, for some individuals, they may be adults and they need to go through therapy or treatment to help them with learned helplessness. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of children, we can do things like cultivate resilience, help children to develop a sense of self-worth and self-compassion. And then also for children, helping them or encouraging them to engage in activities where they have a sense of control. This can be helpful or very valuable in helping to reduce those feelings of helplessness. Now, for let's say an elderly person who maybe feels helpless in the aging process, they can regain a sense of control by doing things in their everyday life, like engaging in small exercises. So engaging in physical activity where they feel that they have a sense of control over their bodies. For adults who've developed learned helplessness over time, sometimes they can benefit from cognitive behavioral therapy. And this would encourage the person to explore where that helplessness is coming from and to address some of the related behaviors. I do want to point out that Seligman conducted a lot of research on helplessness, and he also conducted research on optimism. And so optimism is where we explain events to ourselves in a constructive manner, where we develop a positive internal dialogue. And by doing this, we can help ourselves to break free from a cycle of helplessness. Martin Seligman has written some very good books on the concept of optimism. There's a great book called Learned Optimism that I would encourage you to look into. I'd encourage you just to look into some books that are written by Martin Seligman. I think because learned helplessness is such an important concept for us to understand, not only for our own lives, But for those of you who are going into the helping profession, it can be very helpful for you to have a good understanding of this concept and how it manifests itself, what causes it, and how you can help people to overcome these feelings. So take a moment to reflect. What do you think are some of the phrases that a person might use who's operating in the mode of learned helplessness? And how could you help individuals tell the difference between something they have control over and something they don't? I think we need to note that because helplessness is a learned behavior, there are ways that it can be unlearned. So what do you think people who are helpless or who feel helpless say? What do they say to themselves? How do you know that they're experiencing this? What about statements like, why should I even try? Or things never work out for me? Or there's no point in even doing this? I'm sure you could think of some more as well, some that maybe you've used or that you've seen in other people. We might want to first start out by considering what the person's explanatory style is. So, in other words, how do they explain the events that happen in their day-to-day? Do they seem to be optimistic or pessimistic? So, recognizing that explanatory style is going to be an important step in helping the person to overcome that sense of helplessness. So people who tend to think more pessimistically, they're more inclined to think that the cause of situations or personal situations are internally related. They might have statements like something's wrong with me or I'm never good at. They also tend to think of personal situations as being stable and long lasting. So this might be characterized by statements like, this will happen again, I know it, or I'm doomed to repeat this again. And they also tend to be more inclined to have a global and all-encompassing way of thinking. So I'll botch all my tests that I take. I'm just going to do terrible, or I'm going to mess up everything that I do. I always mess things up. So there's this global sort of approach or to thinking about personal events. Optimists tend to think of personal situations as being more externally related. So if they're not doing well, they may say things like, I didn't get enough sleep, so I wasn't thinking as clearly as normal. Or my partner for the presentation that we did missed a key point. They also see things as being temporary and short-lived. So they might say things to themselves like, this is probably just a one-time occurrence, or it happened once, but who knows what will happen in the future. And they also tend to be much more situation specific. So maybe they're not doing well in one class and they say, well, my weakness is just in this one area, but not all. Or the setback is only related to this, but not to that. So if your friend, the person you're thinking about, is thinking more pessimistically, it's going to be important for the person to think about their patterns of explanation. The patterns of explanation contribute to our behaviors and our thoughts that are related to helplessness. So if we can think about things in a more optimistic way or help our friend to, so that they're looking at events as being externally related, thinking not just of the internal causes, if they're thinking about things as being temporary, so they're not permanent, and if they can challenge their thinking to recognize that when they do have something go wrong, that it's not a global failure, that there actually are just specific situation events that where we might not do as well as we would have liked. We might also want to just challenge our beliefs overall. And we could, if we have a friend that we're thinking of, help them to challenge their beliefs. So we want to think about, how is our friend interpreting adversity? How are they interpreting it? Are they thinking that their adversity is due to something personal about themselves? Are they generalizing this? Are they thinking that this is the adversity that they're experiencing can be described in all-encompassing ways? Are they thinking rationally? So you want to encourage your friend to think much more rationally. And then I think it's also important for us to try to help our friend to find ways to have a sense of control. And I think that I gave you an example about learned helplessness. If we think about, for example, elderly people who maybe physically they're feeling like their bodies just aren't the same and they're not able to do the things they once were. Finding a way to help that elderly person, for example, have a sense of control can help them to overcome feelings of learned helplessness. So think about your friend or yourself and think about how you could, for your friend or yourself, find ways to have some sense of control, and that can help you, your friend, to overcome learned helplessness. So obviously, the way that we're thinking about things plays a powerful role in how we're able to cope. So cognitive interpretation of aversive events can determine whether we feel helpless or not. And I gave you some examples just now. Also, pessimism can contribute to a feeling of helplessness. So reframing our way of thinking so that we're more optimistic. And I know that that is a very general statement to be more optimistic, but I gave you some specific ways of thinking that are related to optimism. So again, thinking about the reasons for things happening as also not just because of something within ourselves, but being rational and realizing that things happen also because of external circumstances. And that when bad things happen, that they can be temporary and short-lived. And that also any setback that we have can be described as situation specific. It's not global and all-encompassing. Now, sometimes when people experience helplessness, we may say that they are behaviorally disengaging and that they are giving up. And actually, this is associated with even more distress. So the more that we can stave off those feelings of helplessness, the less stress we're going to be experiencing in the long run. So what is your explanatory style? How do you explain negative events in your life? Are you more pessimistic or optimistic? And if you are more pessimistic, what do you think you could do to change that way of thinking? What are some specific things you could do to change that way of thinking? Consider, for example, coming up with some specific new phrases that you could use whenever bad things happen. So I think if you come up with some new phrases, like for example, whenever something bad happens, it's probably going to be your natural inclination to think about how this is internally caused. It's due to something about you. But immediately challenge that. Just start with that first step. Challenge your way of thinking and think about the external factors that may be contributing to what it is that you're going through. And then as you're doing these, as you're doing that, you could add some additional new ways of thinking. Thinking about events as not being permanent, but being temporary. Thinking about things as not being global and all-encompassing, but situation-specific. The more we can develop these habits, then the more they will easily become part of our way of thinking. And we don't have to put forth effort anymore once we've practiced doing this. It does require effort, and you might even want to, wear a string on your wrist, reminding yourself to think in this new way if this is how you tend to think, or have some other reminder, something that can help to trigger that way of thinking. Most of the time, giving up is not adaptive, but in some rare instances, giving up might be adaptive. So let's say, for example, that you have a goal that is very unrealistic. Let's say, or I'll use myself, let's say that my goal is that I want to become an actress who lives in Hollywood within the next 6 months. Now, that's not my goal, but let's imagine that is. That's not realistic. I have a lot of things going on in my life. I'm not able to do that, number one. And number two, it's really difficult to break into that industry. And so that's not realistic. And so giving up here would be a healthy response. So we want to think about how realistic our goals are. But we also want to be very honest with ourselves and reflective when we think about these goals. We may think our goals are unrealistic, but they may actually be. Sometimes we think goals are unrealistic because of messages we've heard from others about our capabilities. So we want to be sure to challenge those ways of thinking as we're thinking about our goals and what it is that we want to do. So it can be very helpful to talk with others so that we have a more honest appraisal of ourselves and we're not giving up too quickly. Acting aggressively is another way that people will sometimes respond to stressors, and probably each of us have done this. You may have raised your voice, maybe you've said things that you didn't mean to, and this is where you're acting out towards others who had nothing to do with your frustration. And so you're using a substitute target, and this is called displacement, according to Freud. And I think about people who are exhibiting road rage. People who do this, they tend to, they tend to obviously show a lot of anger and frustration. And it seems like a pretty safe place to be doing so. Obviously, it can be dangerous on the road, but it's pretty safe because there's a degree of anonymity. It's quite different being in your car acting this way than it would be if you were in the hallway and you were acting this way towards someone who you thought was walking down the steps too slowly or who got in front of you as you were walking down the steps. You wouldn't do that, but we do that perhaps in the car. I know I've seen people do this. It actually is kind of scary when people do this. I've had it happen on a couple of instances where it's been pretty frightening where someone's followed me, and you have to think about what's going on in that person's life that's led to that intensity of anger. And again, there's that feeling that that person has that possibly, if we think about Freud, that they may not be able to direct towards the actual target. And so they have these feelings that they're directing to other people. We might see this happen when someone has a bad day at work, they come home, they take their frustration out on their partner or their kids. And so we might think, well, this person's just getting rid of bad energy. And this is a way of getting rid of it that maybe has some benefit. But actually, this can be very bad for a person. We think of this, if we think of Freudian terms, as catharsis, where you're getting rid of emotional tension. But actually, acting aggressively produces more, not less, anger and aggression. So we need to find healthier ways of responding. Here you'll see a comparison of the relationship between media violence and aggression to other correlations. Many studies have found a correlation between exposure to media violence and aggression, but some critics have argued that the correlation is too weak to have any practical significance in the real world. And of course, when we think about correlation, we need to remember that correlation does not mean causation. The only way we can establish causation is through experimental studies. And I'll talk a little bit more about some studies involving media and aggression here in just a moment. So in a rebuttal to the criticism in regards to the correlation levels, in this particular example, what they've done is they've noted that the average correlation in studies of media violence and aggression, as you can see here, is 0.31. And they argue that this association is almost as strong as the correlation between smoking and the probability of developing lung cancer, which is developed or which is relevant to real world issues and is much stronger than a variety of other correlations that are shown here that are assumed to have practical importance. So when we think about ways of getting rid of stress or handling stress, I think it's important to note that if we watch media violence or we play violent video games, it actually can lead to increases in aggressive behavior. This is not just correlational. If you were to go into the Northeast State Journal article database and look at peer-reviewed studies where there have been experiments, not correlational studies, but experiments looking at the effects of exposure to violence on violent or aggressive behavior, you'll find that the results are pretty consistent, that exposure to violence does increase aggressive behavior. And so I have here just an example. You can see that this is a meta-analysis where researchers looked at video games that were violent and aggression. So a meta-analysis is where researchers take a lot of studies and then they statistically analyze all of the studies together so that they can see much bigger patterns of connections than you would find just from one study. So if you'll notice here, they used video game violence as VGV. So it says to clarify and quantify the influence of video game violence on aggressive behavior, we conducted a meta-analysis of all prospective studies to date and assessed the relationship between exposure to VGV and subsequent overt physical aggression. And what they did is they identified 24 studies with over 17,000 participants with time lags ranging from 3 months to 4 years. So that means that they were looking at violent behavior or aggressive behavior in the shorter term and the longer term. And the samples comprised of various nationalities and ethnicities, and the age range were, the mean ages were from 9 to 19. And so they had used a particular type of statistics that allowed for them to control for things that maybe could be influencing this particular relationship. And so when they did this, when they controlled for variables that might be affecting the relationship, what they found was that there was a video game violence did have an effect on physical aggression. And if you'll notice here, there were some differences in ethnicity. They found that the effect was largest among whites, intermediate among Asians, and non-significant among Hispanics. So other researchers might want to know more about why there are these ethnic differences, because that is interesting for us to think about and for further exploration. But this is just one example. You probably have noted in your own life when you've played video games that it does affect your body. And we know, and you can read lots of research on this, that when you're playing, especially violent video games, it increases your fight or flight response. And this can then make you feel irritable and agitated afterwards. It's not for every single person, but for most people, it does lead to that physiological arousal, especially if you're playing games like Fortnite, which are, of course, violent. And that company has hired psychologists to not only make the another common coping pattern, and I think this is related to video game playing and television, this is poor impulse control. I know that, for example, with my kids, when they play video games, I'm just going to use this as an example, that it can be really difficult for them to stop. It's always, I want 5 more minutes. Can I have this much more minutes? And it can be very difficult to stop. And that's without much stress. I mean, my kids, just like any children, they have stress in their lives from just being in school and learning and all the new expectations that are continuously evolving for them. But as your life gets even more stressful, or if you have lots of current stressors in your life, so developmentally life gets more stressful, and then sometimes we experience a lot of stressors, this can lead to even less impulse control and more self-indulgence, which, as you know, can then affect our eating behavior, drinking behavior, smoking, increase the likelihood that we'll gamble, use drugs, and use the internet. And there are various reasons for this to be happening. When we think about using our phone or any sort of device, in a way, this is producing dopamine for many people, especially if they have an addiction, which is that pleasure chemical, just like you would see in drug addiction. Same thing is true with video games as well. And same thing is true with eating. So we might be, we're already as human beings, we want to seek out those things that are pleasurable and those things that resulted in dopamine surges for us in the past. And then it becomes even more difficult to reduce those temptations or resist those temptations when we're under stress. Think about what's happening in your brain. That prefrontal cortex is not as active. The more primitive parts of your brain are. So it is making it even harder for us to resist those temptations. So what can we do about that? We need to think about the environmental factors that may be contributing to that reduced self-control. What can we do to control our environment? We might not be able to deal with stressors at that moment. Maybe there's some of them are out of our control, but could we make it so that we aren't as easily able to access unhealthy foods? Or could we make it so that we're not as likely to spend as much time using our phones or being online? So think about the changes you could make. Or if you have a client, how important it would be to talk about these particular very negatively approaches that might affect a person very negatively, and how you might be able to help them by modifying their environment, those triggers that might lead to those unhealthy coping patterns. When we're under stress, we're also inclined to become more critical of ourselves than we would typically be. And Albert Ellis, who's a very well-known psychologist, called this catastrophic thinking. And this, of course, is part of the cognitive approach. If we think about cognitive psychology, which emphasizes thinking and perception, this is right in line with that way of thinking about human behavior. And so this type of thinking involves attributing our failures to personal shortcomings, so we're not looking at the situation. It also involves focusing on negative feedback that we get, not focusing on other information that might be positive, and then also being overly pessimistic about the future. So this reminds me, as I'm sharing this with you, of what we just looked at, and that was the pessimistic explanatory style. So you're probably noticing a pattern here that our thoughts play a very powerful role in how we experience. So for people who are experiencing trauma or who maybe are, let's say, victims of natural disasters, having this type of thinking, especially self-blame, leads to an increase in distress and an increase in the risk for depression. For people who are experiencing PTSD, this type of thinking can also increase symptoms. It can also increase depression and anxiety among those who have very serious health issues. So changing thinking, challenging those thoughts by looking at, for example, again, looking at not just our personal explanations or individual explanations for why things are happening, but looking outside of ourselves. What are those external reasons? Thinking about things less in global terms and thinking them as more about them as being more situation specific is also going to be important. We also use defense mechanisms when we're experiencing stress. And as you learned in an earlier chapter, these are largely unconscious reactions that protect us from unpleasant emotions like anxiety and guilt. And what they're doing is they're shielding us from emotional discomfort that's caused by stress. But what's happening is that this involves, to a very large degree, a sense of self-deception or a distortion of reality. And so we know that by not being true to ourselves or real with ourselves, not recognizing what's really going on, how we're really feeling, what's really happening in life, that this then can lead to even more distress. All right, so let's see if you can remember a couple of these defense mechanisms. A student allows her family to plan a trip celebrating her graduation, even though she's failing a class required for graduation. Is this intellectualization, fantasy, undoing, overcompensation, or denial? There's a chart in your textbook in this chapter. You'll also find the defense mechanisms in chapter 2 of your textbook. If you can't remember these, I'd encourage you to take a look at these charts. They'll help you as you're studying and thinking about their application. So let's see if the answer that you've come up with is right. The answer is denial. So the person is denying reality or distorting reality. And so let's look at another one. This is a method of looking at difficulties in a detached or abstract way. Is this denial, intellectualization, compensation, sublimation, or rationalization? So again, take a look at your notes that you've taken, perhaps as you've read the textbook. Go back and take a look at the charts in your textbook. There's two, again, one in chapter 2, and there's another that's from this chapter. And let's take a look and see what the answer is. What do you think it is? The answer is intellectualization. So let me show you some examples so that you can refer to these. And I'd encourage you to be sure to think about how you could apply each of these. When have you seen these? And I think that's going to help you as you're preparing for the test, but not only for that, as you're able to use what you're learning from this class in the real world. So here are some common defense mechanisms. Here's denial. The example I got was actually from your textbook, so I was just seeing if any of you recognize that one. Another was intellectualization. So a man who's just been diagnosed with a terminal illness attempts to learn everything there is to know about the disease and the minute details of medical treatment. So here are some examples of defense mechanisms. Make sure you take a look at these and look at the ones that are in your textbook from the second chapter. We all use defense mechanisms to some degree, and the question is, can they ever be healthy? Well, generally, they're not healthy, especially because they are avoidance strategies, and they often involve wishful thinking, and they've actually been linked to poor health. Once in a while using these mechanisms, not such a big deal. But when we're using this frequently, or when we're especially relying on one very often, so we may use one here and there, another here and there, that can be dangerous for us. It can have negative consequences. Or we might find ourselves relying on one particular one very often, then we're likely to experience some negative consequences. So it can be very maladaptive. But again, having a little bit of an illusion may actually be somewhat beneficial. So think about this one for a moment. Rationalization. It's a defense mechanism that's fraught with consequences. Remember, rationalization is an attempt to logically justify generally unacceptable behavior. Sometimes this behavior might be immoral or considered deviant. This is, again, a defense mechanism. It's an unconscious attempt to avoid addressing the underlying reasons for behavior. It might help us to feel a sense or maintain a sense of self-respect, or to avoid feeling guilty about something that we've done. And in most cases, rationalization isn't that harmful, but if we're using it continuously, or we're doing so and we're regularly making excuses for a destructive behavior, it can become dangerous. So I would encourage you at this point, think about what are the negative consequences of rationalization in school, in work, and in relationships. What do you think the negative consequences could be? Let's take a few moments now to apply what you've learned so far. So behavioral disengagement is it associated with decreased distress, increased distress, learned helplessness, or a highly regarded coping method? If you don't remember what behavioral disengagement is, go back and take a look in your textbook, in the video, in your notes. If you know, let's see if you're right. So which of these did you select? If you selected E, that's correct. It is associated with a decrease in distress initially. So initially, when we are not engaging in something that perhaps we associate with uncomfortable feelings or that we fear we might fail at, that is leading then to a decrease in distress. It's really negatively reinforcing. However, in the long term, behavioral disengagement can lead to an increase in distress. Think about the feelings you might have if you're not seeking a goal that you really want to seek out, or that you're not doing something that you know is good for you, or that you really just want to do. And so in the long term, you may experience distress. The reason C could also be included is because when a person has a sense of learned helplessness, they may just, of course, disengage. And that's part of giving up. You're not engaging in whatever it is that you have learned is not going to be, you're not going to be successful at, or at least you've come to believe that because of past experiences where you've tried to do something and it hasn't worked out. Let's try this one. Overall, self-indulgent poses few long-term risks, is not harmful, has marginal adaptive value, or is an effective coping strategy. Which of these do you think is the correct answer? If you chose has marginal adaptive value, that's correct. We know that A is not true because there are a lot of long-term risks. Think about what self-indulgence entails. It can entail overeating, it can entail gambling, drug abuse. So it can have long-term effects. It can be harmful, and it's definitely not an effective coping strategy. It does, at least at first, help us to feel better to some degree, and that's why we might do it. So it has marginal adaptive value. It's a little bit helpful, but not very helpful. How about this one? Blank coping is aimed at changing a person's interpretation of events considered stressful. Is this problem-focused coping, appraisal-focused, emotion-focused, or interpretation focused? This is something that you should have read about in your book and that we will be looking at later. So if you don't know the answer yet, that's okay. What do you think the answer is? If you chose appraisal focused coping, you're correct. So we're changing our appraisal. We're changing our interpretation. Which of the following depicts irrational thinking according to Ellis? Which one do you think based on what you've learned in this video and what you've read? Remember, Ellis focuses on catastrophic thinking. So which of these sounds like catastrophic thinking? My heart is pounding harder, so I must be anxious. My heart is pounding harder, so I'm having a panic attack and will collapse and die unless I get some help right away. My heart is pounding harder, so I should probably lie down, or all of these depict irrational thinking. Well, we would choose B. As we can see here, this involves catastrophic thinking. And you'll remember that that is the focus of Albert Ellis. It is not irrational to think that maybe you should lay down. It's not irrational to think, I must be anxious. Those are rational thoughts. When we think of irrational thoughts, one of those thoughts that Ellis focuses on is catastrophic thinking. And he also focuses on self-blame, as you learned. So B is the answer. In this video, you've learned about the different coping strategies that people often use. You've learned about many of the coping strategies and how they can have negative consequences. You also learned that in the case of, for example, defense mechanisms, that there may be a little bit of adaptive value if we're using defense mechanisms very minimally. You also learned about Albert Ellis and his views about irrational thinking, and specifically a type of irrational thinking called catastrophic thinking. You also learned about self-blame and how this can have negative consequences in how we respond to stress. You learned about learned helplessness and behavioral disengagement. You learned also about some of the factors that contribute to learned helplessness, and you considered what you can do to help someone who may be exhibiting some of the signs of learned helplessness and how to recognize the language of a person who is experiencing learned helplessness. You also learned about indulgence and a reduction in self-control that happens when we experience stress. You learned that because our brains are primed and ready to be more self-indulgent because of how stress affects our brain, that we're even more vulnerable to giving in, to doing things like overeating, gambling, using or abusing drugs or other substances. In other words, doing things that aren't good for us. And again, this is because of the rewards that we get from those behaviors, that dopamine surge that we can get. And it can make it really difficult to fend off or to not engage in those behaviors. You also learned about aggression being a response, and you learned about displacement, and you learned that catharsis actually has some negative effects. So we might think that getting rid of those aggressive feelings or that anger, that it's going to make us feel better, but it actually can increase anger. And it also can have some negative relationship consequences. And then you learn too that by playing violent video games, watching violence on television, that this also can increase aggressive behavior. Part of it is due to modeling, but a lot of it has to do with how our body and brain is affected by watching violence, and also just overall by being exposed to highly competitive situations. Think about video games when you're competing and it's a life or death situation. Yes, you can separate yourself. You know you're not in the game, but it does feel so real. We know these video game companies are creating video games in this way to keep us playing, to keep us buying those things that are going to increase our capabilities of survival, like in the case of Fortnite, for example. And this then causes physiological arousal, which can make us more irritable, more aggravated, and it can take quite a while for us to get back to that normal, balanced state of functioning. In our next video, you're going to be learning about some healthy coping mechanisms. So I look forward to seeing you all online, and please let me know what questions you have.